Okay. So what are we doing here today? Well, I'm going to talk about a paper, but I'm going to ruthlessly editorialize this. So it was, as I will show you, it was a very large number of co-authors, but I'm going to tell you what they either do think or they should think about this paper. It was some work that came out of the, it was work that came out of the Earth League. The Earth League, it's an international collaboration of organizations. The University of Exeter, the Global Systems Institute, is a member. And we convened earlier this year in June in Hamburg, and it was reflecting on essentially 10 years since the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, 2015, it's its 10th anniversary coming up later this month. And it's a diverse community, and we wanted to consider, well, what has been the progress since the Paris Agreement, and what does that progress or lack of progress mean in terms of climate change and what's becoming increasingly commonly known as overshoot. So the title of the paper, Living Beyond Limits, Consequences. Consequences. I was very keen to get consequences in the title, right? Consequences of missing the decisive decade for preserving our planet's life-supporting systems. It's been 5 minutes to midnight for the last 30 years or so, right? And surely we can take the opportunity of 10 years after Paris and the imminent extinction of the available carbon budget for 1.5 to reflect on what has been a, not just 10 years, but decades of failure. So that's the paper that emerged, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Subsequent to that, Johan and I wrote an article, a much shorter article for The Conversation. We don't write the title, but the editors thought the title of The World Lost the Climate Gamble, Now It Faces a Dangerous New Reality. And I will be talking about gambling and risk in some ways later, because I think at the heart of this issue is this notion of risk. Risk of what? How are we managing this risk? Okay, so some disclaimers. I do not represent the views of anybody else, certainly not my co-authors, or my institute or university. And of course, all errors and omissions are mine alone. So the talk summary, what am I going to tell you, right? Well, spoiler alert, we failed to stop the dangerous interference in the Earth system, and you know that already. But this failure has got consequences, and we are still working out what these consequences are going to be. I think in response to that, the primary objective of climate research and policy is to manage these consequences. We can't live in la-la land anymore, this kind of fantastical bend the curve, everything's going to be fine, we're going to recover from overshoot. There are going to be very long-term and serious consequences of our failure to stop our dangerous interference in the climate system. One of those risks and the things that we're going to need to think about are what I call derailment risks, and I'll explain those later. And an associated risk is this kind of technocentric approach in further attempting to interfere with the Earth system, with the climate system. We could actually compound risks and make the situation potentially much, much worse. Okay, so the Paris talks in 2015. Yay, right? I don't know if anyone was around or engaged in climate advocacy or science at the moment. This was a very, very rare high point in which the international community in COP21, 21st conference of the party, finally agreed what dangerous climate change was, and that it was well below 2 degrees Celsius, and that all nations would have a legal obligation to do whatever is required in order to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Subsequent to that, I would argue in 2021 in Glasgow, well below has become understood as 1.5 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial periods. And there's a number of reasons why 1.5 is important. Back in the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, the narrative is that 1.5 is an existential risk to those people and places most vulnerable to climate change. Low-lying island nation states, people who might live in river deltic areas that don't really have any credible form of adaptation from sea level rise, people in lower level or lower latitudes that will be subject to increasing severity of water insecurity or extreme weather events such as heat waves. Since then, however, we've had a decade of development of tipping point science, much of which has come out of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. And now I think it's fair to say that 1.5 represents potentially serious risk to some of the world's richest nations in terms of assets, in terms of liability, in terms of lost coastline, but then also in terms of morbidity and mortality. So 1.5 is important, it matters, right? Now, back in 2015, there were not any credible plans to actually completely decarbonize our societies. And there's a number of reasons for that. The polite society reason is that there will be some industries that are hard to decarbonize. There are no credible alternatives to burning kerosene in wide-body commercial aircraft at the moment. There are commercial electric aircraft, right? But there's nothing like the scale of the kerosene burning fleet at the moment. So that's not going to be decarbonised in time. But then also you've got industrial processes, cement manufacturing, steel manufacturing, which while we can see how their emissions could be significantly reduced, there's no credible plan how we're going to turn these industries around at the pace of scale that we need in order to actually manage these carbon budgets for 1.5. So this is how I explain the origins of net zero. It is still the case that when we talk about climate policy, we talk about net zero. In fact, net zero has become synonymous with climate policy. 10 years ago, that wasn't the case, right? But now it's net zero. And what net zero is meant to do, it's meant to include not just carbon dioxide, but other greenhouse gas emissions, in particular methane, within science-based targets on emissions reductions as opposed to relying solely on offsetting. But this idea that we reach net zero when essentially the amount of carbon we put into the Earth's atmosphere each year is balanced by the amount of carbon that we somehow remove each year. And that is driven by this notion of budgets. The amount of warming that we've got right now is in some respects a remarkably simple function of cumulative emissions since the large-scale burning of fossil fuels. And the more carbon dioxide we put into the Earth's atmosphere, the more warming we're going to see because it increases the radiative forcing. That carbon dioxide stays radiatively active. It stays in the atmosphere for a very long time. So there's this kind of simple equation. You want to limit warming to a certain amount, you need to limit the amount of total carbon cumulative emissions. And that ends up producing a carbon budget. So here's a little animation courtesy of the Global Carbon Budget. Gosh, that's another Global Systems Institute project that I've just mentioned. It's titled Time is Up for Staying Below 1.5 because there's kind of a simple arithmetic that as the years go by and the cumulative emissions increase, which produces an increase in the average surface temperature of the Earth, you end up reaching a point when essentially that budget is gone. And now we estimate it to be about, what, 6% left, and it could be exceeded within, let's say, 4 years. Well, it depends on who you ask. I'm not going to talk too much around some of the competing theories around what appears to be acceleration in the rate of warming. Maybe I will, just to upset Peter, who sat at the back. But what we can say definitively is that carbon budget is nearly gone. So here's some work from Piers et al. Earlier this year reflecting on carbon budgets. They estimate the 50% carbon budget is going to be exhausted in 28. It's worth bearing in mind that previous IPCC assessment reports, they didn't give 50% probabilities, it was like 66, 2 and 3. For a 66% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. You won't really see those budgets reported anymore because they're not policy relevant, because the carbon budget would be exhausted probably within a matter of months now. So now we're back to 50%. And when 50% is gone, then I guess we could go to 40% or 30% or 25%. There are still significant uncertainties with regards to the climate's response to our radiative forcing. And let's remember, we need to put this into context, into a wider context. Here we've got 10,000 years of carbon dioxide as reported by Berkeley Earth, and it's this spike since large-scale industrial processes. What is it, 2.5 trillion tons, over 2.5 trillion tons of carbon dioxide that we have put into the Earth's atmosphere since industrial processes, but over half of that has been emitted since 1990, right? So since the UNFCCC started in earnest, since COP1. So over half the cumulative emissions we put into the atmosphere has happened on the watch of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that almost entirely, along with natural variation, of which you've got a reasonably good understanding of, accounts for the increase in global temperature anomaly. Berkeley Earth last year had it exceeding 1.5. It's actually 1.6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial periods. This does not mean that global warming has exceeded 1.5 or 1.6 because you need a longer baseline. You need 20 years to really zero out natural variability in order to, I knew he wouldn't disappoint me. He's never on time for anything. You need to zero out that natural variability to be able to detect the long-term trend. But with both the increase in surface temperatures and the vanishing carbon budget, I don't think there's really any doubt that 1.5 is gone. But I did mention earlier that the rate of climate change or global warming has been increasing over the last 10 years. This is from an article from Carbon Brief. I think it was last year that they did a special on this. Zeke contributed, a whole bunch of other climate scientists contributed, and it was kind of this discussing, well, you know, for a while, some people, most notably Jim Hansen, previous director of NASA Goddard, has been arguing that the rate of increase of temperatures is much faster. It's been accelerating. It's maybe even up to twice as fast as previous decades. And why is that? And there's been a whole bunch of competing theories and arguments, even dispute that this is a statistically significant signal. And it is absolutely the case that we would need longer in order to determine if that was the case. But I think it's fair to say that there is increasing consensus that the reduction in aerosol forcing, the reduction in high sulfur content burning coal and maybe even marine shipping could have been reduced the global dimming effect that we have inadvertently been producing on the climate, and therefore in some respects unmasking the amount of radiative forcing we're producing through greenhouse gases. And Jim calls it this kind of Faustian bargain that we've been playing with the climate system. Jim is also much more hawkish on climate sensitivity. So when you add in that factor, and when you add in the factor that Jim tends to not be very polite about contemporary climate modeling, I think it's fair to say, he bases his assessments much more on kind of paleo data, on historical data. When you do that, then his assessment of the actual amount of warming that we've got, given cumulative emissions, is much, much higher than you would see in, let's say, even in like the CMIP6 models. Anyway, that to one side. I would argue you don't need Jim to be right to be freaking out. You don't need Jim to be correct about aerosols and acceleration for us to conclude that 1.5 is gone and serious consequences are in the pipeline. And just to remind us that an average increase of 1.5 or 1.6 degrees Celsius a year above that in terms of pre-industrial periods means potentially very significant annual temperature anomalies up to 5-6 degrees Celsius. And you see most of this in the higher latitudes, a process called Arctic amplification. And also Europe, which is pretty much the fastest warming continent for reasons which are kind of interesting, and I don't entirely understand them. But these are average anomalies. And of course, the concerns that we've got about climate change is not changes in averages, but the changes in extremes. So these average anomalies are being driven by, in some places, extremely high temperatures. So the 1.5 budget is gone. I know there was an awful lot of skepticism at the time that 1.5 was ever credible, given existing political realities, let's say, given existing political, maybe even economic systems. But this showed for a 66% chance, this is from Robbie's work back after the Paris Agreement kind of was being agreed, even for a 66% chance, you'd see the longer that you leave it, the more and more heroic your rates of mitigation become. To put, let's say, 4% reductions into kind of context, during COVID lockdowns, there was periods in which global emissions were being reduced at a rate of maybe 6 or 7% or something. So in order to produce anything like the rate of change required for 1.5, you'd have to be either shuttering significant regions of the global economy or doing something else quite radical to our industrialized societies. But 1.5 is still alive, right? That's what you hear. That's every COP you go to. That's what we stay. We've got to stay the course. The Paris Agreement hasn't failed. We can still limit warming to 1.5. That's because net zero is transitioning to overshoot. So I say here that net zero relies on overshoot. 1.5 relies on overshoot. 1.5 has always relied on overshoot. There's always been this understanding within the Paris Agreement that we're going to exceed 1.5, but then hopefully temperatures will be dragged back down by the end of the century. And they're going to do that because around 2050, when we reach net zero, we're going to transition to a period of net negative. So we're going to be removing more and more carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere than we put into it. And in doing so, reduce cumulative emissions and therefore reduce warming. And I will talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to talk too much about it because I've talked about it an awful lot in the past. But let's just take a moment to reflect on where we are right now. There are lots of people who don't think climate change is real for a whole bunch of probably motivated reasons, right? Ask the insurance industry, they'll tell you, because these are the people, these are the organizations on the hook for paying for climate-related extreme weather impact events. $162 billion this year. Climate catastrophes are creating a new market reality for insurance carriers. One way to interpret that is that there will be some places which become literally uninsurable because the premiums cannot be afforded. No insurer wants to take that risk. Costs pile up as climate change adds 600 billion in insurance losses. We see rising heat deaths. This is one of the easier ways to determine climate change impacts on morbidity and mortality, because the warmer it gets, the more likely you're going to get extreme weather events such as lethal heat waves. So the rate of heat-related mortality has increased by nearly a quarter since the 1990s. We're seeing increasing wildfire and drought impacts, and that is having a non-trivial impact on economic strain, productivity losses equivalent to maybe $1 trillion, the costs of heat-related deaths among adults reaching $261 billion. This is safe climate change. This is acceptable climate change. This is the decision that society, through its either elected politicians or the politicians that come to govern those systems or nation states, have determined is acceptable in the context of how much greenhouse gases can be put into the atmosphere to produce this amount of warming. And none of this should be a surprise. There is, I think, quite compelling work that in many respects we have potentially seriously underestimated the distribution of risks and therefore how much economic loss, how much morbidity or mortality might be in the pipeline. But these numbers, in some respects, shouldn't surprise anyone. This is just the unavoidable consequence of living in a climate system which has become significantly warm over a geologically instant timescale. Yes, the climate's changed a lot in the past. You know, we've got 3.8 billion years of history of life on Earth, and some of the most intense mass extinction events have been associated with climate change, but probably nothing like this has happened in terms of radiative forcing, either for millions and millions of years or perhaps even ever, right? So this is really exceptional. So we're transitioning from net zero into overshoot. And yes, maybe Paris Agreement was always about overshoot, because you would never have gotten the United States, you would have never have gotten even the United Kingdom, which is meant to be a progressive, forward-thinking climate nation, to agree to doing the things that would really have been required to manage the carbon budget for 1.5 even below 2 degrees Celsius in 2015. The United States would never have signed up for the required rapid decarbonisation. So it was all about on-ramps. We could offset through nature-based solutions, forests, carbon sinks. We can invoke technologies, carbon capture, storage, carbon dioxide removal. We can kind of taper the curve such that we will arrive at a safe place after we've overshot by a bit, down by the end of the century. So the architects of the Paris Agreement were extremely clever on how they crafted that agreement. And I'm extraordinarily grateful for their efforts in being able to produce what has been still humanity's best efforts at avoiding dangerous climate change. But how are we going to do that, right? How are we going to drag temperatures back down? Well, I call it the wacky races. If you've got an idea to remove a large amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, then you just go knock like a philanthropic fund and they might give you, I don't know, a few million or something. And yes, that does sound incredibly better because I tried it myself and it has not worked yet. But how would they do that? So there's a number of different ranges and approaches. On the top here, we've got so-called nature-based solutions, some of which just seem to be little regrets options. They seem to be generally good ideas. Let's take biochar. You take agricultural waste, farm waste, the waste that's left over from, let's say, threshing wheat or something, and you turn it into charcoal, process of pyrolysis, locks up that carbon in that biomass, and then you can put that biomass high in carbon back on the land to increase productivity and locks a significant amount of carbon up. You can undergo tree planting. This could be reforestation, so planting trees which used to exist through a process of maybe habitat restoration, or afforestation, where you plant very large areas with typically fast-growing alien species, which might not be very good for biodiversity. You can reduce the pH of the ocean, reduce carbon dioxide concentrations directly in the ocean. And taking carbon dioxide directly out of the sea, that doesn't seem to be a tremendously bad idea either. You can accelerate the silicate weathering cycle by essentially grinding up mountains and then spreading those minerals on crop fields, which would accelerate the kind of natural process in which carbon dioxide reacts with water, produce weak acids, which then react with the minerals to lock up carbon dioxide. You could undertake ocean fertilization, which has been attempted badly in the past and not gone very well. But the idea of overcome nutrient limitation in the top portions of the ocean that would produce algal blooms, which when they die would draw that carbon down to the bottom of the sea, or what is where an awful lot of money is going today in engineered removals, direct air capture. This is an artist's impression. Imagine vast arrays of kind of air conditioning units which suck carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere. That gas is compressed and then pumped deep underground, probably into, not exclusively, but probably into depleted oil and gas fields where it will stay forever. Okay. This is a bit of a snark. Better late than never. It's been relatively late that the climate science community, the earth science community, the people who are involved in thinking about carbon budgets have made it really quite unambiguously clear that a lot of the approaches or maybe assumptions around overshoot are not very credible, right? There is overconfidence in our ability to be able to remove large amounts of carbon dioxide. Sustainability are needed because if you undergo large-scale afforestation, probably as part of BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, you could threaten water security, food security, you could displace people from the land, you could decimate biodiversity. There could be a whole bunch of bad things that could result from that attempted climate solution. There is over-reliance on land for carbon dioxide removal. When you add up all the land, just simply in terms of land surface, there just doesn't seem to be enough to be able to take out what could be heroic amounts of carbon dioxide. And this means there is essentially a carbon dioxide removal gap. And I would say to this, just very briefly, what do you think policymakers would do if you provided them with an option to not undergo rapid mitigation, but propose future technological solutions that will recover us back into a safe climate? This should surprise nobody. And it is quite interesting how it has been relatively late that the academic community has, through important work, been making clear that some of the promises of overshoot may not be delivered. There's other ways to think about this conceptually. I always like the work of David Ho. He's a US geoscientist who imagines carbon dioxide removal as a sort of time machine, right? So if you think about cumulative emissions determine total amount of warming, and those emissions have built up over time, well, carbon dioxide removal is trying to go back in time to unwind some of those emissions. And the point that David makes through this analogy is that our ability to go back in time is currently extraordinarily feeble. If you're looking at engineered emissions, if you take a year's worth of greenhouse carbon dioxide emissions, which is the best part of 40 billion tons a year, over that entire year. We're maybe able to wind the clock back maybe a few minutes or something, right? It just doesn't have any meaningful impact. The other analogy that I would suggest we think about this is in terms of parachutes. This idea that a parachute is a safety device. It can save your life, or in this case, it's safely arresting some kind of payload down to Earth. But parachutes can only work at certain speeds. If you try and put something that is far too heavy on that parachute, it accelerates the parachute, and the parachute has become impaired, damaged, it will rip, and then it's about as much use as a chocolate fireguard, right? So these technologies have a purpose, they have a potential role, but it has to be in the context of decarbonisation. So the way that David describes it, yes, we could deploy CDR, but CDR is only really going to make sense once we've done the bulk of our decarbonisation. Supposing that it can somehow offset 40 billion tonnes a year is just dangerously uninformed. Okay, so that's the climate system. In some respects, that's the good news, because the bad news is that the Earth system is responding to human impacts, not just in terms of it's getting warmer, heat waves are increasing, but there is perhaps evidence that elements of the Earth system is losing resilience, is becoming less able to deal with anthropogenic forcing. So what this video shows is a visualization of carbon dioxide emissions. So CO2 is a well-mixed gas. Doesn't really matter where you emit it, but you can see these points here. These are individual power stations, right? And it's well-mixed. So it doesn't matter if it happens in Baltimore or Birmingham or Bangalore, that carbon dioxide would eventually migrate its way throughout the entire planet. But this is what I'm particularly interested in. This pulsing, this is showing the day-night cycle, and it's the drawing down of carbon dioxide during the day and then respiring carbon dioxide out through these significant areas of terrestrial vegetation, for example, the Asian and the sub-Saharan African rainforests. It's this cycling of carbon through days, through months, through years, and over long timescales, which has been importantly buffering up our emissions of greenhouse gases. So you probably already know, about half of all the carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere each year, about 40 billion tonnes, half of it ends up in the sea or on land, so about a quarter in the land and a quarter in the sea. If those natural carbon sinks start to fail, if they start to slow down the amount of carbon dioxide they remove from the atmosphere, or in some places even begin to put carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere through outgassing, we go for a situation where it becomes a sink to a source, then the challenge we've got when it comes to carbon dioxide removal becomes much, much more serious. So I'm thinking about now the planetary perspective. So one of the things we were very mindful of when we met in June was the planetary boundaries concept, because our lead author for this paper was Johan Rockström, and Johan has pioneered the application and development of the planetary boundaries framework. Here it is in 2009, and it imagined you've got these various dimensions of the Earth system. You've got climate change, yes, biosphere integrity, land system change, freshwater use, biogeochemical flows, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading, stratospheric ozone depletion, and novel entities. And human impacts are radiating out, such if we're in the circle, we're in this kind of safe zone. And as you're going further from this kind of circle, we're entering the increasing zone of uncertainty and then into the danger zone. And back in 2009, the big ones were biosphere integrity, just a simple result of land use change, ecosystem destruction, biodiversity loss. Whatever the rate of biodiversity loss or species loss was before humans, it's probably much, much higher now, maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands higher. They're tens of thousands times higher than the background extinction rate. Climate change was, of course, a concern, but then also biogeochemical flows, the sheer amount of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer that we put on the ground on farmlands, which is having a devastating impact on aquatic ecosystems. Well, as the years have gone by, the number of boundaries that have been assessed to have crossed have increased. So we are today in 25. We determined that there are about 9 boundaries have been assessed, and 7 of those are crossed. Biosphere integrity is being broken up into terms of functional biodiversity, of genetic, which is kind of simple kind of measure of the total numbers of species. Novel entities is of serious risk because of the increasing number of industrial processes, the new species of chemicals that we're producing that we have really no idea about. Things like PFAS or plastics, microplastics has been really capturing people's attention, and climate change in terms of CO2 concentrations and radiative forcing. So we're going backwards, right? Or forwards in the wrong direction. So this is what we wanted to talk about. And the way that we considered we're going to visualize that is this. And this is a complicated picture, and I don't have much time, but I will do my best. We've got this kind of idea of a planetary boundary, safe and just space. We were kind of still well within it in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol, and we could have turned back then, right? There were some bold promises made by the international community about stopping the dangerous interference. There was a whole series of missed opportunities, and then something of maybe of a reset in 2015. We could have turned round, but we didn't. We have what we call this missed decade of climate action. So here we are now in 2025, where we need to undertake a rapid, radical pivot in order to meet our sustainable development goals, many of which are stalling or even going in reverse. So that's not good. But turn this thing around such that we recover back into a safe space, which is going to have to be net negative somehow by the end of the century. If we don't do that, we continue exceeding these planetary boundaries, then we get to this point of a critical juncture with this idea of a planetary threshold, tipping points. I'll talk about those briefly in a moment. And then when we were developing this figure, I said, no, look, it's not a discrete threshold, right? It's going to be increasing kind of a graduated range of risk. So don't make this a solid line. So the designer came back, okay, I'll make little dots in it. Okay, fine. But it's the idea that there is this notion of a critical juncture, which I try to capture with the notion of derailment risk that I'll talk about later, where if we can't turn things around, it becomes increasingly likely that we just end up making things even worse. So up here, we've got social unrest, failure to meet SDGs, generally very bad, not just Earth system, not just bad climate outcomes, but bad social outcomes, because we would have failed to both arrest warming, arrest the exceedance of other planetary boundaries, and also fail to meet our sustainable development goals. What this is, in some respect, is kind of an overshoot. And an overshoot, you should be expecting a correction. Okay. So none of this is new. The first World Conference on the, not just the climate, but the Earth system, the human environment, was back in 1972. 1972 was also the date of publication of the infamous book, Limits to Growth, of which popularized this notion that we could exceed boundaries, we could exceed limits, and if you do that, then you're going to undertake a correction, and that correction could be interpreted as some kind of extremely bad outcome for society, maybe some kind of collapse. So us saying somehow we've exceeded this notion of a safe space, we've exceeded boundaries, therefore there might be some kind of extremely unpleasant consequence in the pipeline is nothing new in some respects, right? So enter overshoot plus. Right? So we've had net zero, we've had overshoot, and now we're entering the region of overshoot plus, I would argue, because if you are paying attention, you can see this narrative is now increasing. So overshoot plus has us think that temperature exceeds this threshold, whether it's 1.5 or 2, or maybe within a planetary threshold. With the deployment of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, we'll be dragging temperatures down. But in the meantime, we have geoengineering, which is going to shave off maximum temperatures. So this is some work that I've been progressing with Mandy Bissett, and the starting point was a recent paper by Hyslop that referred back to some older work. So I did not know back that John Shepherd came up with this, co-authored the napkin, what's called the napkin diagram, because apparently they scrawled on the back of a napkin. And what it shows is how increases in temperature could be, in some respects, managed or regulated through a portfolio of approaches, right? So here we are now, and here we are 200 years into the future. So one thing I want to point out right away is that Overshoot Plus is making the assumption that we are going to be doing things not just for years or decades, but centuries. So this is a multi-generational project we've set ourselves. Here we've got business as usual. Well, we don't want that because we're going to have temperatures sometime around the end of this century, which is kind of 5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial periods, and that's catastrophic. So what we'll do is we'll take mitigation, which is this curve, but mitigation is assumed to only be able to reduce warming by so much. So you add in CDR, this curve, well, that's going to apply a reducing factor, right? But it's SRM, solar radiation management, which you need because you can scale that pretty quickly such that we can limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And then with adaptation, we can even take it down even further so that the consequence of the amount of warming is not so that it produces a level of impacts or suffering that are considered to be unacceptable, right? Mitigate, CDR, SRM, that's the approach. And how are we going to do that? Well, most of the action at the moment is in solar radiation management. There is some cloud thinning as well, but the main attempt is to reduce the amount of energy it's received on the surface of the Earth from the sun, right? And how are we going to do that? Well, we could increase surface albedo, the brightness, so marine cloud brightening, make very highly reflective bubbles and clouds. Most of the interest seems to be much higher up in the atmosphere, towards the higher portions of the troposphere, stratospheric aerosol injection. If you inject sulfurous compounds into the high portions of the atmosphere, it mimics the actions of a large volcanic eruption. There have been eruptions, most noticeably Pinatubo in the early 90s, that had a global cooling effect for a few years of maybe up to 0.5 degrees Celsius. If we replicate that by flying millions of sorties of wide-bodied aircraft that have been converted into tankers and then spray these sulfurous compounds, then we could have an immediate cooling effect. It won't do anything in terms of carbon dioxide concentrations, it won't do anything in terms of ocean acidification, but it would buy us vital time in order for us to be able to recover back into safety. That's the plan. And I think this is the plan you're going to hear an awful lot more about as temperatures and impacts increase. But here's the thing about overshoot. In much of the overshoot discourse, it's assumed to be a temporary and a recoverable from. But there's nothing about the definition of the term. Overshoot just means to go past an intended stopping or turning point inadvertently, right? We've overshot something. And overshooting is, in some contexts, extremely serious. Overshooting a runway excursion, produces significant damage. We would be talking about millions of dollars to fix that airframe, not to mention what other kind of insurance costs you're going to get. The airframe could be entirely lost because of the overshoot, and there could also be associated loss of life. So this is the recent, 29th of December 24. Feels more recent than that. I thought that was, okay. A flight from Bangkok that was landing in South Korea undertook an overshoot, and there is a video that shows the crash. So depending on how you feel about such things, I mean, just don't look at the video. You can't see anyone, but it's obviously a plane crashing. I want to show the plane crashing because it is important to see the conditions of the actual incident, right? So that's why I want to show the whole thing. The thing to bear in mind here is that the landing gear is not down, the flaps are not set, the aircraft is clearly not configured to land, and it's sliding along the entire length of the runway, but it's what happens there, right? So the story appears to be that the aircraft was coming into land and there was a bird strike. It flew through a flock of migrating ducks. It took out one of the engines. It possibly took out both of the engines. So the pilots attempted to make an immediate landing, and somehow, The landing gear was not deployed, so they didn't have wheels and brakes to slow down, but also the flaps were not deployed, and flaps are surfaces at the trailing edge of the wings that seriously or significantly slow down the stall speed of the aircraft to allow it to take off with less runway in order for it to land with less runway. But the reason that was a catastrophe, so there were 181 people on that aircraft and 2 people survived. The 2 people that survived were 2 crew members strapped in right at the rear of the aircraft, and as the tail section separated from the rest of the airframe, they were actually relatively unharmed. But everybody else died because it impacted that large structure. And this is the tragic irony about this incident, and this is why I think it's got important lessons to tell us around managing risks with regards to overshoot. Because what is this thing? Well, this thing is a part of the ILS system, the instrument landing system. It's also got a light array on it, but these systems are designed in order to allow planes to land safely, right? So if it's low visibility, in fact, even if there's zero visibility, this system allows planes to land in situations or circumstances where they would not be allowed to land or be able to land in the absence of it. But of course, by situating it there and putting it in this very large concrete structure, they made a situation which was serious but potentially survivable into one that was catastrophic. And of course, a lot of the discussion and the air crash investigation is going to focus on a whole bunch of reasons. And one of them, what on earth was this structure doing there? A structure that was meant to be increasing safety actually produced a catastrophic outcome. So we often think about risk in terms of like the Swiss cheese model, right? So if you imagine that you've got slices of Swiss cheese and there's holes in it and you kind of randomly throw them together, it's very unlikely you're going to get a pathway through all those different slices, right? But there are some configurations where there will just be a hole. So in the context of that air disaster, you had the aircraft flew through a flock of birds. You had one of the engines was probably destroyed. Potentially the pilot also then shut down the other engine by mistake. There was a failure to deploy the landing gear. There was a failure to deploy the flaps. And all of those things could have been survivable, but it was that last slice, that last element, a long-term planning decision by the airport to situate a concrete bunker at the end of a runway, which made a runway overshoot into a mass fatality. So what's that got to do with climate change? It comes back to this notion of what climate change is and what we're meant to be doing. We go back to 1992. The formation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. What is the point of this organization? To combat the dangerous interference in the climate system. What does this become? To combat the dangerous unintentional interference in the climate system. We didn't mean to put all these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, with the deliberate or intentional interference. So earlier this year, I contributed to some work. Again, Mandy Bissett was involved, but this was led by Olivia Lazard, and I've done a number of projects with her. When we tried to think about geoengineering risk, or the deliberate interference in the Earth system with regards to trying to limit overshoot risks. And there's a number of things that I think are important with some of this work. There are risks involved when we undertake this kind of solar radiation management or any kind of geoengineering risk. The first is that, well, it just doesn't work, right? Or it might even have a counterproductive effect. The second one is that it may cause harm, and certainly some geoengineering will, right? In terms of air pollution, let's say. Or it could exacerbate international tensions. And I know some of the people most concerned around solar radiation management are most concerned about it because of the geopolitical implications. How are we going to manage the deployment of solar radiation management? What happens when country A deploys sulfur injection and then country B experiences some kind of extreme weather event? How does that complicate the already very fraught situation of climate change policy negotiations? And the thing with SRM, we always know that there's this thing of termination shock. If you stop it relatively quickly, then its effect fades. And if you haven't reduced emissions in that time, well, then we know that global average temperatures could increase very quickly. I think more importantly, we've got systemic destabilization potentials And then you've got this notion of overshoot risk. So the new series of risks that are going to be generated because we are now in a period of overshoot. And geoengineering is just one of them, right? Now, some people will argue that you can actually manage these kind of overshoot risks by deploying geoengineering, or there's a compelling reason to do so. How much longer?
10 minutes. But
okay.
You're eating into question time.
I don't know questions. Right, sorry, we did start late. Okay, so for example, AMOC shutdown. I just find it astonishing that some of the science is concluding that the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, even on a low emissions trajectory, has got basically a 1 in 5 chance of shutdown, right? Because the consequences of AMOC shutdown is described as a tipping point we must not cross, right? So basically, we need geoengineering to scale up in order to be able to somehow offset these kind of risks. Well, Mandy and I have had some thoughts about that. There might be some compelling reasons to deploy geoengineering, but we need to be more nuanced. I'm not saying we shouldn't under any circumstances, but at the moment, certainly the kind of discourse analysis that I see is incredibly crude, if not simple-minded. The risk calculus, and that you've got risks of climate change and risks of geoengineering. And basically, if you just kind of wait long enough, the risks of not doing geoengineering would outweigh the risks of unabated climate change, because climate change risks are potentially almost infinite in economic terms, right? We could lose everything if we go beyond 3, 4, or 5 degrees Celsius. So even though there are risks in geoengineering, we will be forced to deploy it. I think that's problematic for a number of reasons. I've been doing some work thinking about, well, what's geoengineering doing? Well, it's getting us to focus on things like constants, stocks and flows, buffers, relatively superficial. I mean, sounds kind of crazy to call it relatively superficial things to address the climate challenge, when really what we could be doing is deeper engagement using kind of Mello's typology of deeper interactions, because there are systemic problems that we might need to address, but geoengineering, carbon dioxide removal, what's deemed to be policy relevant is keeping us in this area. I want to briefly show this figure because this shows who's funding geoengineering in the context of carbon dioxide removal. So this is work that's been led by Mandy Bissett. And when I started working with Mandy, I assumed it's oil and gas, that of course is all over CDR. And it's not, it's big tech. It's the big tech companies, it's in some places the AI boom, which is driving a significant movement of money into what is, in many instances, startups about carbon dioxide removal. Which leads me finally onto this idea of derailment risk. Because with increasing overshoot, we're seeing situations where worsening climate consequences has the potential to destabilize societies, which distracts them from decarbonisation, which is ultimately the thing that we must do to stay safe, which will then worsen climate consequences, destabilise societies, and on and on. It doesn't have to be like that. You could imagine that as climate action increases, it reduces climate impacts, but if climate impacts were to increase, it increases climate action, which is a kind of virtuous circle that we want. But the thing I'm particularly concerned around with overshoot is that climate impacts are going to be degrading our abilities to progress decarbonisation. With increasing impacts, destabilisation, political destabilisation and international conflict. And I think we can already see some of the elements of these emerging. You look at the Valencia floods, the destabilisation, the political destabilisation in Valencia after these devastating floods, which benefited climate-denying right-wing political parties. This is a complicated figure that I'm not going to show. I do just want to point out what's another way that we can see these kind of derailment risks. Here is the EPA website, the Environmental Protection Agency, about climate change in October 8th, 2025. Causes of climate change: since the Industrial Revolution, human activities have removed large amounts of carbon dioxide, blah, blah, blah. What does it say now? What are the causes? Natural processes are always influencing the Earth's climate, and it can explain climate change prior. However, recent change cannot be explained by natural causes alone. What does it talk about? Changing the Earth's orbit, variations in solar activity, volcanism, and right at the end, it talks about carbon dioxide concentrations. It doesn't even mention emissions or human emissions, right? This is the level of denial that a political system is now undergoing in order to try to resist the unavoidable consequences of overshoot. So, ways forward. If you don't do this, then I can't really see much point in doing anything else. We've been saying this for 30 years, so obviously that's not sufficient. We also need to transform food systems into carbon sinks. A current driver of climate change is our food systems, and somehow they need to be transformed, maybe through regenerative processes, probably significant reduction of animal farming and husbandry and agriculture. We need planetary restoration, not just plant a bunch of trees. Natural ecosystems have been regulating carbon for billions of years, and we need to restore the ones that we destroyed. At the same time, we need to accelerate climate change adaptation because the consequences have already arrived, and we can have a massive difference on people's outcome and quality of life through increasing adaptation. And we also need to increase the societal resilience. The energy transition, the sustainability transitions themselves need to be resilient to societal disruption, to the consequence of climate change. And also, I would argue that we need to develop new ways to make polluters pay. Rich industrialized nations are responsible for the climate crisis. They're the ones that should be paying for the loss and damages and the accelerated mitigation that this situation demands. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, James. We are out of time, just in general. So if
Is there anyone?
we're going to run over at your own risk and peril. I'm not taking responsibility for this. But if you have questions, raise your hands. If you have questions online,
No one outside.
please put them in the chat.
There's no one outside. So if you have to go, if you want to go, then please do.
But otherwise, we're going to stick around for a bit. How's that? I expect there'll be a lot of questions because we've still got about 70 people online. So I'll take multiple at the same time. Is that it? Take both of your questions and your question.
James, it's Harry Stellham. I'm a farmer and a forester, and I was just going to ask you about your use of the word "re" in the in your "what do we need to do?" And I think I just wanted to have your view because one of the senses that I have is one of the ways that it's a kind of greenwashing of this is the environmental movement is this conversation of putting stuff back. It's going to solve the problem, and I think in many ways, I was just going to ask to what extent you think this is true. Is that it's in a way a denial of the problem. There is an endless thing of thinking, you know, we can, I don't know, we can re-wet the peat bogs of Dartmoor, despite the fact that their climate change modelling shows that those peat bogs are not likely to survive for the next 25 years. You know, we can reintroduce oak woodland, despite the fact that it's going to be very slow growing and it's probably going to be dead by, you know, in 100 years. So what do you think about the continuing use of which implies an imagination that we can turn back the clock to an imagined past?
Steve?
So I certainly don't think that any of those kind of restoration approaches will bottom any parsnips if they are also not accompanied with a very rapid reduction in emissions. There's an argument as to whether the amount of warming that we've already got means that some of those restoration activities are probably moot. Because what we can't do is try and restore ecosystems to the previous climate, because that climate is gone, right? So I think we do need to be very careful, and I do agree with you that there can be a tremendous amount of motivated or wishful thinking when it comes to, well, we'll just, you know, let the earth heal. I think in some respects, there needs to be not just a restoration, but maybe even a retreat from some of the imposition that we've put on the earth system, which could require quite radical ways of living.
Steve?
Thanks, James. Do you have an explanation for why things like these floods in there was some in Germany and the ones in Spain? Do you have an understanding of why it would seem to be sort of non-intuitive that people would react to things like floods by being less for climate action rather than more? Do you have an explanation for why that is?
So the story in Valencia sort of goes that there was a climate shock, which was, in this instance, that devastating flooding, right, which caused significant social and economic consequences, but then is the discontent bit. There was absolutely mismanagement of both flood warning, flood protection, long-term planning, that made that region much more vulnerable to a kind of climate-related extreme weather event like that. But the other thing is, you're dealing with situations where those events are well outside the distribution, right? So in some respects, you have to be much more forward thinking about the kind of risks you're going to have. But that discontent resulted in populists becoming popular because they used it as an opportunity to point out incumbents' failure, graft, corruption, inability to understand people's living concerns, which then ended up reducing both decarbonisation, which makes climate shocks more likely in the future, but then also I think there's evidence that they're even stymieing adaptation as well, right? Which then further increases vulnerability, which makes discontent more likely at some point in the future. Now, obviously that can't carry on because once you get that class of politicians being closely associated with the failures themselves, then okay, maybe we could transition to some other kind of system. But there are numerous examples now of the destabilization of societies as a result of climate change, not translating into increased ambition or effects being taken. And I think Peter's got his hand up.
Yeah, are you happy to take a few questions at a time?
Yeah, sure. But I mean, I'm
going to ask a question here and then I'll come to your two questions. So Kai is asking if the university/GSI is involved in fossil fuel non-proliferation, the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And if not, can we do it?
Well, I can briefly answer that. I don't think as an institution that we are, but as an individuals, I think we are. I think that's...
Thank you. Yes. It strikes me that in everything you're saying, there's a possibility that the nature-based solutions could address multiple problems with exceeding planetary boundaries simultaneously. And in terms of public messaging, might it be helpful to focus on the very broad impacts of nature-based solutions? Is there anybody looking at that? So rather than the individual peat bog impacts, carbon reduction, etc., methane reduction, the whole picture from nature-based solutions to reduce the derailment risk, but also possibly bypass some of the political and economic barriers that we know exist. And just as an aside to that, because I really want to emphasise the need to change the food and farming systems that have been mentioned, should we in our mainstream communications talk more often about reducing emissions than focusing solely on oil and gas and talking about carbon?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
James, very interesting. I wonder what your thought was about the continual framing of the climate change problem in terms of thresholds and boundaries. The reason I asked that is because I suspect that we did it for reasons of motivating action originally. You know, don't go beyond 2 degrees, it's dangerous. And people misinterpret to me it's not dangerous until you get to 2 degrees, and then 1.5 was a similar thing. And when you do that and you get close to the edge, it tends to lead people to think that either there's no reason to move, you know, we give up, it's all game over, or to do things more drastic. And you know, I'm very much in favour of research on geoengineering, but I'm concerned that it might be done on the basis that 1.5 is dangerous and 1.4 wasn't, or 1.6 not much more dangerous. So I wonder what you thought about that framing, whether it was still a useful frame or whether it was something we need to change.
Okay, so that first question, the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, it's kind of like the neglected sister of the IPCC, and they have their conference of the parties and they're meant to be progressing how biodiversity ecosystems should be central components of any kind of sustainable society. So there's no end of ways of thinking about and justifying how the effective management, or maybe a more effective, resilient relationship with the Earth system should be key. So it's not just carbon, right? And in fact, many respects, if you just have this laser-like focus on carbon, you end up producing all these kind of really quite unfortunate outcomes. For example, EU directives on biofuels, which accelerated the rate of deforestation in Southeast Asian rainforests. So that's an important one. And I do agree around some of the, maybe some of the rhetoric and the framing of thresholds, right? 1.5 to stay alive, this 5 minutes to midnight, because you either believe it and therefore you're going to take emergency measures, or you are skeptical, or you do believe it, but then we pass 1.5 and the world has ceased, has not ceased to end. So what does it mean? I would be much more interested in thinking about it in a graduated context, but we can already do that. I mean, loss and damages tells us that. We can see that through increased morbidity and mortality, 500,000 people dead each year, that ones we know of, right? And also just the fundamental injustice in that those being most affected are those least responsible. There seems to be enough to motivate rapid mitigation. But of course, the reason mitigation hasn't happened is because, well, of politics, money and power.
It's a really interesting talk. I'm particularly liking the graph there. Is there an effective way to use that discontent that we see very commonly with populism in a progressive way? Thinking perhaps about the Green Party's shift towards wealth inequality, or other movements using things like citizens' assemblies as a way to take that discontent and then channel it not only to mitigate the discontent and improve people's social and economic circumstances, but also as a way to tackle climate change, because wealth inequality is very heavily linked to increased emissions. For example.
So this one, what's the solution? Rapid fossil fuel phase out. But who should we not ask how to do? We shouldn't ask climate scientists how to do that. Right? Climate scientists will tell you how much carbon we put into the atmosphere, and they might be able to tell you what some of the biophysical, maybe the societal consequences will be, but they can't tell you how to do that, right? I mean, in my personal opinion, there seems to be abundant opportunity to link climate concerns with things around, cost of living, insulating homes, increasing people's thermal comfort, reducing fuel poverty, reducing the amount of mold, health impacts. There are numerous reasons why you want to be living in a more efficient house or home. And then also climate change is almost like a byproduct of that. So it has been interesting. It has been puzzling as to why there isn't more climate populism. Oh, Ernesto, then Andy then.
Yeah, so I was going to invite everyone in the room to think about our political avenues and pathways as the carbon capture technology. Because I saw in Peter's question and the assumptions when we talk about what's going on in the politics of climate change, that is about cognition. It's about people knowing what's going to happen. And I think what you were talking about, what the data shows, is that it's not about us not knowing that climate change is going to be awful, but that the way in which we are organizing, right, with these COPs and with this endless talking, is actually amplifying the problem. A little bit like carbon capture, right? You're not going to have enough time. Mm-hmm. So, in a way, it's an invitation to rethink our political assumptions about democracy, about what's driving action, and about what we can actually do if we keep thinking about, let's go to the COPs, let's find consensus, let's deal with these issues, because I think we have a lot of years of evidence that that is not working. So it's like we got the wiring and all the mechanisms wrong. What can we do about that?
Yeah, so we need to be working higher up, like we need to be using the bigger lever. Where is it? Oh no, I can't get past my really impressive animation. Right, we need to be using a bigger lever, right? 15 years ago, I gave a lecture about climate change, and one person whose work I really respect said, I totally get it, right? And I totally understand we need system change, but we don't have time. Right, we don't have time. So, we don't have time to spend doing this. We've got to do this work. It's like, okay, 15 years later, how did that go? Right. If we don't start or attempting to work on the systems that's going to provide most leverage, most purchase, then I think we are just going to be fiddling around, literally whilst Rome burns.
As you say, it's not so much the average temperature increase that's a problem; it's the extremes it's the dynamics of the climate system and the Earth system when forced by this. Now, SRM, solar radiation management, is actually a completely different forcing to the greenhouse gases, and in fact, what you're doing is you're kind of storing heat in the lower atmosphere and then trying to stop it getting in the upper atmosphere. If you don't put it in exactly in the right place, you end up with potentially, it seems to me, as far as climate dynamics and climate extremes are concerned, it could be a lot worse than not doing anything. I mean, you know, so my question would be, partly would be to climate modelers, you know, do they have sufficient confidence to actually say, you know, what the effects of it are? And then because I'm a skeptic of climate models, I would answer that they don't, actually.
Okay, we do have a question there before Peter jumped.
Questions everywhere.
Okay, right. But all I'll say about that is one of the very active areas of research using GCMs is SRM injection, what it does in terms of reducing climate extremes, reducing maybe tipping points. I think what's absolutely vital is it completely transforms the situation in which you've got some kind of public or common good. If the United States reduces emissions, it benefits just as much as any other nation. SRM is not going to be like that. What's going to motivate a nation to do SRM is probably reduce or offset some kind of extreme weather or conditional regional climate that it's experiencing. And as a byproduct of that, it may well make the situation worse somewhere else. So in whose interests is it going to serve? And that's where I think you have the whole geopolitical dimension coming in.
Same true of CO2 though. I mean, they're very patchy, as you've shown, global warming is very patchy. We're trying to get Russia to sign the Kyoto Protocol, they said they would like it.
Right. So we've run about almost 15 minutes over now, and we've still got loads of questions. So I'm really sorry. I'm not going to take any more questions. I'm just going to ask one last one that's sort of a summary of what's going on online. We need some positivity, James, and we want to hear in 45 seconds, how are you going to achieve, how are every one of us individually and especially collectively as part of the guidance system going to achieve the 6 things that you promised at the end of your talk?
Okay, that was me being positive. I've got a non-positive talk I could have given, right? So I'd like some recognition. I'm trying my hardest. Look, we have to work on these bigger levers, right? And there's no reason why we can't. There's no law of physics and nothing in the laws of thermodynamics, which means we can't rapidly decarbonize, we can't restore, we can't recover, we can't work in different relationships with the Earth system. What is blinding us from a lot of that is this obsession on constant stocks flows, on the way in which we conduct our societies, and I would argue the primacy of economic growth with an extremely narrow defined notion of what our economies are for. You know, what's the point of our economic systems? What's the point of the goods and services they produce if in doing so they are literally unpicking, hacking away at the vital Earth system systems that we all depend on? So any political system, any political party, any politician that can't understand that, get rid of them, right? Now, I say that knowing that it's very difficult to get rid of politicians. In some places, you don't really have a democratic system to do that. And in supposed democracies like the United Kingdom, the best we get is to decide who's going to rule over us for the next 4 years. They're not very participatory, which is why alternative governance, you don't tell me to wrap up now when you ask me to give some positivity, which is why participatory, inclusive democracy in which people actually contribute to the governance of their societies, their communities, their nations, is, I think, in my opinion, the thing which can move that system at the rate at which it needs to move. Reliance on technological systems, we're just deluding ourselves and probably going to make the situation much worse.
Right. Thank you, James. All right. On that note, thank you everyone online, and those of us in the room, let's carry on conversation around coffee, and then later Firehouse, you said 6:30?